and construction law arbitration. He obtained certification in project management, cost engineering, construction audit, quantity surveying, and others. Mr. Felipe has been an international consultant and expert witness in advisory and dispute cases since March 2020, and he also leads the development of a global consulting and expert witness businesses, Kongthi. If too long, let's, Mr. Felipe, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, the AACE Arabian Gulf section, for the opportunity for organizing this webinar. Thank you so much for everybody who has taken the time to attend this webinar. I know it's not super early for you. Where I am, based in Houston, it's earlier, it's 11 a.m., so it's easier. So I appreciate your time, appreciate your interest. I hope you enjoyed the presentation, and I also hope you participate with questions and so forth. So I have a presentation for you guys today. I'll share my screen. Let me see if I can do that. And we'll follow the... Oh, by the way, apologies, since I can only speak English, I cannot speak Arabic. So there'll be a limitation from my side. I hope the English is fine with everybody who's on the call. Share screen. Please let me know if you can see the full screen.
Yes, we can see it. Go ahead.
All right, excellent. Thank you so much. So this is the schedule we have for today. So we are basically on time. Again, thank you for the welcome. I'm going to be talking to you for about 50 minutes and on basically everything around labor productivity losses. And as I said, do ask questions as you have them. But then in the end, after 8 p.m., we're going to open the floor for quick Q&A. But if you have any questions throughout the way, please ask them. If I have the opportunity to see them here in the chat, I'll try to answer them as we go along. So the topic today is unforgivable mistakes in the quantification of loss of labor productivity. As I don't know if you have had access to the abstract, which I'll share with you in a moment, but I'll be talking a little bit about the very concepts of productivity itself, labor productivity itself, then loss of labor productivity or inefficiency, and then how to calculate and prove that those have taken place, as well as I'll share with you the unforgivable mistakes that often happen when you see a quantification of those such claims. So that's me. I have already been introduced, so do you want to spend any time in here? So let's start with the definition of loss of labor productivity. Okay, I mean, sorry, not the definition, but as an abstract, as an introduction to the matter, I wanted to say that it's a very common situation. As you see, I'm guessing most of the participants, if not all, are very involved with construction projects. So I'm sure you all have seen it, have probably dealt with it, and have probably been frustrated as well by the difficulties and the limitations you can find due to so many factors around that topic. When either quantifying it or reviewing it as an owner, trying to come to a common ground when it's being requested or claimed by the contractor. It's very, very common to take place. At the same time, it's very, very, very difficult to actually quantify it, right? And to demonstrate that it has actually occurred, that you actually have the right to claim for it, and that the damages are being properly quantified. So hopefully we'll shed some light on all those matters today. So today we also explore the different mechanisms available for this quantification. There are many, And then we also talk to you in a little bit more detail about the measured mild, which is the most commonly accepted or the mostly accepted mechanism for the quantification, and for very specific reasons. We're going to explore them today as well. Finally, I'll provide examples of a real case that I have experienced in my professional career, where some of the things we say that should not be done, and we'll explore them as well, have been done. And I'll share with you what the result was. Okay, some definitions. I'll be using for a lot of the presentation the AACE recommended practice number 25R03, estimating lost labor productivity in construction claims. I'm sure, again, as a lot of you are probably members and are dealing with those construction projects, you're probably aware of it. Some will know in more detail than others. If you haven't read it yet, I suggest you do. It's not that long and it's very well put together. So I'll definitely suggest that if you haven't read it, do it. And then again, if here or in another opportunity, if you have any doubts, I'll be happy to discuss them with you and share experiences in the future. So a couple of definitions from the recommended practice. So productivity. That's a measurement of rate of output per unit of time or effort that can be usually measured in hours. Right? So more often than not, you'll see the quantification of productivity being done, output, input versus output, and that'll go in labor hours. And in terms of output, it can be, I have some examples here. It could be meters of concrete placed, or it can be linear meters of conduit installed, or it can be even like bigger parts of like if it's a transmission line, for instance, you can do miles of line installed, or if it's a pipeline, it can be miles of pipe installed and so forth. Per time, right? Per time, never forget that. So production obviously is the rate of production, so it can be just the output. Then productivity will be that divided by the amount of time, whatever amount of time measure you want to use. So the productivity loss is the difference between a baseline and a baseline, meaning a point of comparison against real, right? Against as built productivity. So very simply put, so productivity is how much you advance in time or in amounts of time. And productivity loss is when you are being less productive than what you either planned or what you have experienced before. So we'll discuss that all in more detail in the coming slides. And as you'll see, and as I said in the beginning, it can be very frustrating often, just because of in order for you to do a good loss of productivity, labor productivity loss analysis, you have to have really good detailed contemporaneous information on the project. So cost control and tracking the work, the work hours and production has to be in a lot of detail. So the more detail you have, the better. And that obviously, it always comes down to, there's a cost discussion, experience, availability of project control staff and tools and so forth. But the more detailed, the more documented project, the better you'll be able to manage it, obviously. And then when there's a situation like a loss of productivity in labor, you'll be better equipped to demonstrate that something has happened, and then you'll be better. You'll be more successful as well in claiming the damages that might occur. From a contractor's perspective, right? From an owner's perspective, you'll be better equipped to either approve what is right or not, right? Or not to be in a situation where you have to pay, or you feel like you have to pay because you don't have enough information to make the right decision. And sometimes that's what it comes down to, right? Because the owner needs the asset ready and operating, and just might not have enough information, and it might become a decision that goes far away from what actually has happened on site. So some common causes of lost labor productivity. So the recommended practice that they're using here as a reference lists 25 of those. There are a few more, but this list is pretty complete. There's a lot of them in here. And when you read through the details of them, you understand that, a lot of the things happen all the time to a lesser or greater extent. So one thing that I can suggest for anybody who is dealing with construction, project controls and or claims quantification or review and or approval, having the list of, especially for those who are preparing such a claim, having the list in front of you will be very helpful, because one of the very first things you want to do is to identify what has happened. So what's the origin of the lost labor productivity? So, having the list and understanding which one of them will just better equip you to understand if some of those things have happened, right? So you see like fatigue, for instance, meaning, staff after if they're just working for too long, or if they're, there's tough conditions, they might be, more tired, more fatigued than what they should have been. And, so their productivity starts to decrease. That's something that can happen, right? Another example is, acceleration, obviously, either directed or constructive. It doesn't matter. So there's just more work being done at the same time. So it's either more people or more hours. So accelerating the work, and that can decrease the productivity rates, right? So the amount of output per time that you experience in the construction site. So here's a list of 25 of the items that can be considered common causes. As I said, there's more, but this is a very complete list. Recommended step-by-step as per the recommended practice. So at the first sign, you identify a loss of labor productivity, you already start looking for what's next, right? So the first time you think you're producing less per time, right? The output is not going as you think it should have. You have to go back to your baseline, make sure it was well put together. There are no flaws in it. Then it's going to help you determine if you're really looking into a loss of productivity, of labor productivity. If you think there isn't, it can just mean that you are perhaps comparing the actual productivity to a baseline that is not, the expectation was not set right, either contractually or just in your plans. So if that's the case, then what you actually have to do is to replan it and think through what's going to happen next. But chances are is that you're not going to be able to claim for that loss or for that lower productivity than expected or than the baseline, right? So you have to review the baseline. If it is, if you think there is, the productivity is being lost, then you want to identify the root cause. As I said, the list that we showed before is going to be very helpful in making sure you identify the exact cause of that lost productivity. Next thing, when you know what's happening, you want to know if the owner will be paying for it, right? Are they liable for that event or for that matter that's happening? Because if they're not, then you have to find some other ways to deal with this. If it is, go back to the contract, make sure that you issue notices, whatever notices you have to, and make sure that the communications are being placed as per contract. You don't want to lose the timing of it as well. A lot of contracts will say you have to notify the owner on time in so many days sometimes, which is very common in Felipe and some other contract forms. So you want to make sure the contract is being complied with. You start supporting the evidence that's going to be used to put together this analysis. And when you have it prepared and you feel comfortable with it, you can prepare your claim. So never forget, you have to demonstrate entitlement, right? So going back to the contract perspective, you must make sure that the owner has to pay for it. Basically, if they have to know this is the kind of damage that's going to be recoverable. Then you have to prove causation. That can be very tricky many times. You have to prove that, and there's different ways of doing it. We're not going to be exploring it today, but basically you want to make sure that whatever is happening, that is, the owner is liable for, they are actually resulting in the loss you're experiencing. And finally, you want to quantify and want to make sure that you can demonstrate that whatever output you're experiencing now is lower than what it should have been. And then you can quantify how much it's costing you to do the work, right? So you can claim for the difference. It's a very high level. We're going to be talking about more details of the process going forward. So some attention points. Optimal productivity is rarely, if ever, at the maximum production rates, right? So in a construction project, in the more complex, the bigger, the longer, the more you see that happening. So whatever is called optimal productivity is really hard to experience on site because so many things happen. So you have to take that into perspective, especially when you're planning, but now we're talking about already during the execution. So loss productivity claims must compare planned, and that's what the recommended practice shows. And I'll talk about that in a moment. So planned productivity and documented productivity rates, right? With the actual productivity rates. So what does it mean? Again, the very basics, what I said before, you want to compare what is happening to what is being planned. What is being planned can be, understood as the baseline. And then for you to be able to, more often than not, to be able to properly or to successfully claim for the difference, whatever is called planned here really needs to be understood as, your optimal productivity, your real productivity at unimpacted periods of the project. We're going to get closer to and in more details about that very soon. So obviously non-optimal productivity is inefficient, right? So it's costly, takes longer, costs more. That's a given, right? However, if it's driven by factors that you knew as a contractor at the time of the bidding, it's going to be really hard to be compensated for that, right? So there's always also, have to, as you go along the process, you have to be mindful that, there's public information available about certain conditions. Perhaps could be weather, could be, some changes in logistical aspects of the project. So if it's impacting the supply chain, and you knew already about something, COVID is something that has been talked about a lot during the last 2 years for obvious reasons, has impacted every single one of us. And they have generated circumstances that, many times could have not been known before, but there's also a lot of contracts that have been signed throughout the COVID period that, have conditions that were known at the bidding time. So you also have to take, be mindful of that. So you want to be, and we're still going through, details of the recommended practice. Okay, so they specifically mentions that you have to be able to be in a position where you sufficiently demonstrate a number of things, right? So you want to be compliant with the notice requirements, as we said before. You want to make sure that whatever you're saying is generating lost productivity is happening during the performance of the work, right? And it was also unforeseeable at the time and not under an approved change order. because that happens as well often. We'll discuss that in a moment, but it's often the case that you see a situation where the contractor is claiming for something that the owner has already approved in a change order and has already even paid for. That's one of the things that happened in the example I'll be sharing with you. You want to be able to demonstrate that those events were beyond the control of the contractor. So there's nothing, it was not at their control, essentially. If your claim, the claim is being directed to the owner, you want to make sure it is either caused by the owner or it's a risk that has happened that was owned by the owner somehow, and they were liable for that event or for that risk taking place. Because if it was not, then there's no point in claiming, to the owner. This is going to say, well, that's it's not my risk. So it's a very important component of all this conversation, as well as any other claim in construction, and I'm guessing any other industry. But if you're claiming for something, you want to make sure you're claiming the right person and you do have the entitlement to do that. So the recoverability of the damages is not contractually bared, right? So there's barred, sorry. So there's nothing in the contract that says you cannot claim for the recovery of such cost or time. And also events caused, the cost of changing the performance of the work. Events caused a change. Oh yeah, of course. So the actual events you're discussing here, identifying, you're showing, that they are causing, they actually caused the change in the performance of the work. So as I said before, you're comparing levels of productivity. So you want to make sure that the different levels had been caused by the events you're identifying. So I mentioned we were going to introduce, or to just kind of list them, the methods that of estimating the lost productivity. This is a list that is being put together. Again, it's presented at the recommended practice. It comes from literature specifically reviewed from cases in the US and Canada. So it might not be exactly the same everywhere, but the basic concepts, I haven't seen working in a lot of places internationally. I haven't seen the logics behind that recommended practice being challenged by anyone anywhere. So even though it's based on literature and case law from the US and Canada, a lot of it can be used and can be well used anywhere else, as far as I can tell. So it starts with, and it's put together in an order of preference or chances of success. Again, based on that documentation available, literature available. So the first group of methods are called project-specific studies, meaning, if you use information from the very same project to discuss what's happening in the project, chances are you're going to be more powerful in demonstrating, things that are happening and why there's a loss happening, and why, you have the right to claim for the reimbursement of additional cost or for additional time. And provided that it's comparing information about the same project, increases the chances that it's going to be better received by the owner, and increases the chance you're going to get paid for it, right? It starts with the measure mile study, which we'll discuss in more detail soon. Then it goes through the earned value analysis, work sampling method, and craftsman questionnaire sampling method. So the last two are more, after you identify something's happening, you start, creating contemporaneous information about the actual work that is taking place, or the craftsmen that are working on a specific work. So we start generating, contemporaneous information about what is happening, what's the impact, how's the productivity being affected, and you start generating information that can be used later on for the studies you want to put together when you're claiming for loss of labor productivity. So, and again, not only in terms of groups, but within each group, they also have ordered in terms of, whatever is more successful in terms of, the methodology. So the measured mile is the one that is, again, mostly accepted and more successful in, when you utilize them to present your claim for that kind of loss. Then you have project comparison studies. So you can compare, not only work with projects that are related to the project you have in front of you. So again, this is project specific, and that's why it's often more successful than other types. Then you have the specialty industry studies. So there will be studies about acceleration, for instance, that say, if certain types of acceleration happen, chances are that it's going to impact your productivity rates, and you can use that, to compare with whatever is happening to your contract specifically. There's studies about learning curve, very interesting ones, actually, that show how you can be more productive over time, how you gain production over time as you start to learning, right? It's the very concept of the learning curve, learning what you're doing. So a lot of the parts of the process and of the activities of the work that's being done become more automated in a sense that is more repeatable, and that obviously give you the so-called learning curve improvement in labor productivity. So studies like that can show you how you're either gaining productivity, productivity rates as you flow throughout the construction project. But I can also show that if you have stoppages and have to come back again, and you have to change the team, that learning curve is going to apply again. So you can show also how you're losing productivity based on certain things that can happen in a construction project. So that's the list. We're not going to go through each one of them. Then you have general industry studies. So now you're comparing very generic information, not necessarily put together for that purpose with your construction specific project. So if you don't have any of the other, if you're not able to demonstrate some other way, then you can obviously use that. Thing is, more often than not, especially if it's, in my experience at least, if you go to a more formal dispute resolution process, such as an arbitration or litigation, or even dispute board for that matter, it's going to be less likely that just a general industry study compared to your project will put you in a successful position. So again, the more project-specific information you have, the better. Then I have the cost basis studies. That is also very often used. So you have the total unit cost, the modified total labor cost, and the total labor cost methods. That's basically comparing just total cost to whatever you expected the project to cost, right? And that can be done at a different levels. So it can be like the total cost, everything, the entire cost, or you can modify it to consider errors in your proposals or in your bidding process, and your own mistakes that you know of. And then have the total unit cost method, which is compare obviously those same studies at the unit cost level. Those are generally, there's a lot of, so you can see it's like at the bottom of the list. It's not very well accepted. It will often be accepted if there's no other way of presenting your studies, and for a number of reasons. And one of them is that, if you're just showing all the costs, even if you modify it, you will very likely, just by the very nature of construction projects, you will be including their inefficiencies and and additional costs that you have incurred due to things that are not, the owner is not liable for. So that's why it's not very successful unless you can, again, do a lot of additional proving. So to demonstrate that you have lost labor productivity based on a cost basis, analysis is very, very difficult. And the recommended practice also talks about, after you have done your studies, whichever way you kind of pick or can use, it's always a good idea to come back and impact your schedule based on this new level of productivity you studied, just to see. So it's an additional way to compare productivity to what it would have been based on your own planning for the project. And another thing that the recommended practice also mentions that I see with very good eyes by decision makers, such as arbitrators and judges, is that, if you can use a combination of those methods and achieve the same conclusion or conclusion that go in the same direction, that's very helpful as well for them, because then they start understanding that, well, really, even if you see it from different angles, you see it still makes sense what's being claimed. Some notes of caution, again, still coming from the recommended practice. In most cases, the loss of productivity is due to multiple causes, which makes it way more difficult to prove, right? So you have to identify the cause that's happening, that is generating the loss. Otherwise, just becomes more and more difficult. That's what happens in a lot of the disruption cases. So you end up start having like multiple causes. So you want to make sure you're tracing it, as precisely as possible and as well documented as possible to the impact you are claiming for. The root cause of the loss productivity must be determined from project records and our project personnel before you start estimating the impact. That's also, again, how information from the very same project is key in this process. So you want to make sure you have records from the project that are contemporaneously produced, and they have not been impacted or manipulated after the fact. And also having personnel who have lived the project will be very helpful in telling you, what happened, and if it's a more formal dispute, testifying as witnesses, fact witnesses of what has happened during the project. This is always very useful information in terms of rebuilding the history and understanding what has actually happened during the project, and this will be key information for you to demonstrate a loss in labor productivity. And because of that nature, it's often the case that whoever is preparing the claim will have to be in a position where they can prepare different analysis, as I was saying before. So as you prepare those analyses and have different, hopefully converting conclusions, you can start rationalize the results and make sure you present the claim in a way that is very compelling and well documented. So some common mistakes, as we will see in the example I have to share with you, they happen, and they happen often. So calculating the percentage change on a cost rather than a labor hour basis. So you want to make sure that, when you're calculating, when you're doing your studies, you're actually going to the labor hour basis, not just the cost, as we said before. Another common mistake is applying the calculated lost productivity factors to an as-bid labor hours rather than actual labor hours. So if you do the as-bid, then you generate a whole lot of different requirements in terms of proof, because then all of a sudden you have to prove that your bid was actually put together. There was nothing missing there. There were no, contingency, for instance, was actually put together and was well put together. You didn't assume more risk than you should have. So all of a sudden it becomes a much more complicated exercise, and often makes the claim, hard to get approved. So that's another mistake that happens often. So another mistake is applying the calculated factor to all the hours on the project, right? Rather than only during the time that the project has been impacted. So it's perhaps a simplification or lack of experience, but you'll see that happening as well. You get claims of that nature. They just go like, this is my loss of productivity, and then apply for entire hours of the project instead of the period and or just the type of work you're doing or not analyzing. Failing to account for typical learning curve productivity factors. We'll talk about that as well. As I'll show you what we do for the measured mile calculation, just a generic way to recognize those learning curves. Well, I'll show you in a moment. It's just, you ignore what the beginning and the end, like for 10%, but I'll show you graphically how it looks. And also failing to deduct the additional labor hours already paid for in change orders. So, if the owner has already agreed to, and those hours have already been recognized for, then you have to subtract them from the calculations you're putting together, right? Because otherwise it's double dipping. Sorry. And finally, failing to deduct other factors that might have impacted the productivity, but that are not recoverable, right? So if the contract says, that rain days are not going to be, paid by the owner, doesn't happen often, but in the example I have, it did. Then there's no point in you ignoring that, some days there was no work or there was very little work because of rain. You do have to recognize them. If you don't, then you're giving the owner a reason to deny your claim, and you might lose time, and you might be inefficient in recovering those additional costs you have incurred. So you want to make sure you don't forget them, right? Deducting those additional things that have happened that might have impacted your productivity rates. So the definition, as per this, I have the source here from Schwarzkopf book, Calculating Lost Labor Productivity in Construction of the Measured Mile. Okay, so it's defined as the most widely accepted method of calculating labor loss productivity. It says that it compares identical, and I'll discuss that in more detail soon, but it says that it compares identical activities in impacted and non-impacted sections of the project in order to ascertain the loss of productivity resulting from the impact of a known set of events. So when it was put together, I think it's very well written, but it says that you're comparing identical activities in impacted and non-impacted sections of the project. So nowadays, and little after, so what is accepted nowadays is that you can compare similar or as similar as possible activities, and also you compare impacted against non-impacted or least impacted sections of the project, because sometimes it's just impossible to find a non-impacted section of a project, and you want to be mindful that if you can prove that the impacted, it's something that you as a contractor can assume the difference in productivity. So that's why you're not comparing to bid productivity levels. Then it's fine. It also says that it's favored because it considers only the actual effect of the alleged impact, and thereby eliminates disputes over the validity of cost estimates, as I've seen before, or a factor that may have impacted productivity due to no fault of the owner. So as we will see, you have to exclude those such factors. Oops, for some reason I went too far away. Sorry. Okay. Some of the requirements for you to be able to put together a measured mile study, non-impacted, or as I said, least impacted period, with measured performance exclusively resulting from the contractor's work. So you want to make sure that the productivity rates that you are looking at are not being impacted by others. The measured mile must also be significant. So whatever piece of the work, it's not very clear how much is good enough, but you know, in my experience, you want to make sure that you have a significant piece of the work that hasn't been impacted or that is considered least impacted. So you can compare that as a, you know, as the baseline for comparison for a claim. You don't want to be in a situation where you say, like this book says, you know, it would not be reasonable if you to extrapolate just 2% of progress to 80% of the cost, for instance. So if you have like 2 good days in a 2-year contract, you cannot say, oh no, those 2 days is when my measured mile was, and I'm going to extrapolate that to the entire project and claim for the difference. That's not going to happen. And if you're doing at that level, if you don't, depending on how you are presenting, depending on the jurisdiction, it's also often the case that you consider the contemporaneous information as correct. So you don't necessarily do additional work to prove it's correct. I myself, as a quantum expert, when I go anywhere near something like this, we definitely want to make sure that the information is supported and correct. So we want to make, we go through the hustle of understanding how the information was put together, the controls they have in place. If there's some level of certainty that the information you're looking at actually came from the controls in place and they actually reflect what's happening at site. It happened again, I'm sorry. I went all the way to the end. Okay. You have sufficient contemporaneous information, as I was saying, like, you want to have those job cost reports, production rates reports, on an hourly basis, per staff, per work section, and so forth. The more information you have, the better. You want to identify impacts on single party. Again, in this case, hopefully you'll be able to identify, whatever the owner has done that has impacted you, or whatever has happened that the owner is liable for, as I said before. So you can claim for that additional cost or time as a contractor. On the other side, if you're the owner, you'll just do the other way around. And variables affecting productivity that are unrelated to the claimed impacts must be removed from the impacted period calculation, right? So if there's weather, if there's mismanagement for a period of time, perhaps the supervisor wasn't at site, or there was, subcontractor issues, you have to consider all those and exclude them from the calculations. That's also what makes it so difficult, because there's a lot of variables included in this kind of work, this kind of assessment. You have to consider them all. So how does that look like? So if you have an actual cumulative man-hours graph, so that's the typical, like you can see, there's hours being accumulated, and as you go more hours, you have more progress. It goes up to 100%. So you want to make sure you exclude, the first 10%, the last 10% in a very practical way. That's a way to take into account the, learning curve perspective. So, in the beginning, you're not going to be working a very normal kind of productivity rate. It's not optimal, nor in the end of the project or of the activity you're looking at. And then you start looking how it looks like, right? So you see like there's moments where you're spending much more hours or to do the same percentage as in other cases where, with less hours, you did much more percentage progress and so forth. So that can take you to a situation where you look into the graph and say, Okay, so this is the period of time where we have not been impacted, or it was least impacted, right? So you see like we're progressing at a constant rate, good rate. It represents in this example 30% of progress from 20 to 50, so it's reasonable. And then if you can identify causes, that impacted your productivity here, where you had to use a lot of more hours to do just 10%, and here, where you had to do a lot more hours to do the remaining 40% of the project, then you can say that this is your measured mile. So this rate here, this angle that shows, productivity rate of X% per hour input is, yeah, go on. It's a question, or, okay. So if you can use that productivity rate, you use that to extrapolate the productivity rate of, this activity that you're looking to. So excluding the 10% initial. Yes, go on. Sorry, there's a question.
طب بص الاجنده دي كده، احنا السي ار ار في حاجه.
Yeah, so I think there's somebody with their mics on. If they could, if you have a question, happy to answer it. If it's not a question, you could just turn them off, please. That'll be helpful. Thank you. Yeah, so as I was saying, so once you have that ratio calculated, and that's the optimum or the measured mile rate, you can go from the moment where you started the project and then calculate it, extrapolate it and see where you're going to finish had not those impacts happened. So in this example here, we're saying that, by 90% of the project, we would have spent 2,400 hours if nothing had happened at that, measured mile rate. But then the actual shows that we have spent 3,600 hours. So the difference is the lost efficiency, right? So your lost labor productivity demonstrated graphically. So some challenges. The analysis is somehow subjective. So sometimes, it's just hard to be very precise. You will ignore some natural variations in productivity across jobs and also throughout time, also ignores productivity that you might lose over time for longer projects, more complex projects. And it's also difficult to clearly prove the relationship between cause and effect. So you have to take a step at a time and make sure you do a very detailed analysis, improving every single step of your claim. So this is an actual photo of the project that I have a case study that I wanted to share with you. So basically the contractor filed claims, for additional costs, both direct and also indirect, for prolongation, and ended up going to an arbitration, right? So the claim included, as I said, indirect cost for prolongation and also lost labor productivity. And the main method, they utilize different methods, but the main one they utilize to prove or to justify the direct cost lost with labor productivity was the measured mile. And they incurred many errors, many of the common mistakes we have seen in the recommended practice, as I'll show you. So this is an extract of an actual report that they utilized in their demonstration of their measured mile. So they had, a starting period, they had a period end, and they also had the difference, right? The full period, the full analyzed period. And they were comparing, so they had dates, right, for the starting period. So they were saying like from May 12th to August 30th, we had a period that there was not impacted or that was least impacted by the owner. So they said this is where we had optimal or good, productivity. It was more or less like 100. So for this specific activity, they had about 300 days, if I remember well. So it was significant even though I know it was more, it was about, I don't remember exactly, to be honest. But so they show the progress as per the reports. So they show like in May 12th, they had 20% progress. In August 30, they went to 32. So that makes a variation of 12%. And in man hours, they had that much of payment applications by May 12th, and that much 800,000 by 30th of August, showing the difference. So basically what they're saying here is that when I have not been impacted in 111 days, I was able to progress 12% of this activity, and that's how much it represented in terms of cost, right? So based on that, they did a calculation that shows how many man hours in money per progress percentage. So that's basically this number divided by that number. So they said for every 1% of progress, it cost me 36,000, more or less. And that's how much I was progressing where you're not impacting my productivity. Based on that, and on the fact that they had progressed as per progress reports, approved progress reports, they had progressed 85%.61 when they had left or when the contract had been terminated. They say, well, if I'm doing 1% at that cost, I should have spent not more than 3 million to do 85%. So that's basically 85 times 35,000. That's how they're saying how they were, trying to put forward their case to the arbitration panel. So we started looking into the detail, right, of how they got to those numbers, and started identifying some issues that I'll share with you. I'll try to do it quickly because of time. So they compare that number here that they calculated with whatever they had actually spent as per their systems. We did additional testing here to see that the actual spent was also incorrect, but for this particular study case, what matters is that they basically compared that number here with the calculated one that had been essentially an extrapolation of what they had as a study on their measured model, right? So they were claiming the difference. So we started looking into that and using their own information, their own experts' reports and their own reports, their own lawyers' written documents in the case, we were able to identify that they were also charging for poor management of their own side. There were lack of supplies, they were not able to, there were a lot of rework that they had done for their own errors. There was, a number of disagreements, involuntary acceleration. So all those things that they could have not charged for, and they were, so they never discounted those. We did, based on information from their own reports. They were also considering hours utilized after they actually left site. So there was also hours that were obviously not productive. So made no sense to include those hours on the productivity analysis. And they were also considering factors for which the owner was not liable for. As I said, rain, strike, and overtime, some other was not acceptable under the contract terms. So this is a report of their own from their quantum expert. They were showing the last measurements, and they were, from their expert reports, the total direct cost that they had in this particular work was 4.1. And remember, they were using 4.2 million in their calculation. So to start with, we already showed a difference that had to be adjusted for. So they could not compare whatever they were extrapolating before with their system's total cost, because even their own expert was saying, well, no, after they left site, the direct cost should not be there. It's man hours. Then there was also man hours that were quantified based on recorded absences and delays that of their own. So we also subtracted that. we were also able to identify 400,000 of man hours that should have been discounted because they were actually approved for and paid for in change orders. So we put together a list of all the change orders that had, you see, like they're not in order because they were different. The actual numbers are the real change order numbers in the specific case. And for every change order, there were an amount of man hours that were considered to be, implemented, and the progress as per their own. Oh, that's a B here. As per their own progress reports. And we basically said, all those hours for all this work you're saying that we should be paying for, it's already been paid for, so you cannot charge for them. So this was also discounted. There were other discounts based on rework, stoppages due to rain, as I said, and strikes. All these amounts were also subtracted from the calculation, which took us to a position where we basically had a situation where the original number, deducting what their own quantum expert was saying, so the original number from the system was off by 75,000 or something. And then we discounted, the costs of hours that had already been paid for, or some things that they were not liable for, the owner was not liable for. And using their own information, we were able to calculate that if there had been an impact by the owner, the actual cost that they have incurred based on whatever the owner has done was actually lower than the quantification that they had done. So in essence, we were, the case was showing that if there had been impact interference by the owner, they were actually helping in the productivity rates. And that's how the decision was made in this specific case, in an actual arbitration. And with that, I finalized my presentation. And I think we are right on time, actually 2 minutes early. And I'll be happy to take questions. Let me see if I have questions here at the chat. Otherwise, feel free to open your mics and ask questions, please. Or just comment if you want to share a case, or let me see some of the comments here.
Okay, thank you very much, Mr. Gutierrez, for your detailed presentation. So anyone from the group who wanted to ask questions, feel free to unmute yourself.
I see that there's some comments here. I'll read them if you're okay with it. On the chat from Khalid. One of the ideas is to forecast the expected productivity per month or the reporting period based on the budgeted amount or work hours, amount to be earned, and the spread from P6, for example, versus the forecasted money or work hours to be spent from the man-hour histogram. I'm talking here from the preparing of the execution plan. So any variances from this forecast, the question will raise up. What is happening in month, week, causing low or high productivity? Yeah, no, I think that is really good, and it's really good as a project happens, right? So as things are happening, it's a very useful tool for you to identify variations and start adjusting, right? Correcting the course of the project. But again, if you use that kind of comparison to prove that you're losing productivity, especially if it goes to, in my experience, if it goes to an arbitration, or if, somebody else, like a third party, is making a decision on your behalf, then they'll be willing to see, if you compare plan, then you have to prove that the plan was perfect or close to that. And that makes it much more difficult to prove productivity, loss of labor productivity, sorry. But as you go along the project for correcting and monitoring, it's very good. Certificate of attendance.
Okay, thank you. Anybody, you can raise your questions. So before we award our certificates. Okay, I think.
There's a question here from Mohamed Omar. Any benefit of using productivity chart against moving average productivity? I think unless Mohamed, please let me know if I understood it correctly, but I think it goes in the same kind of discussion we were having before. Right? I mean, if you're comparing, the chart would be perhaps a plan or a source of comparison, which is good in terms of planning and correcting, and it will be useful actually to explain as well variations, especially variation A to variation B. But to prove a loss, you want to show that you're able at some point in time to have that level of productivity. Otherwise, you're comparing, an expectation at some point, a plan, right, to what was actually happening. And as we know, plans, no matter how detailed, how good they can be, they're never perfect, right? I mean, they're really useful, good, important tool for planning and executing a project and anything in life, really. But they're not perfect. Right? It's the very essence of a plan. There will be variations, and sometimes not going to be the owner's fault. So I think it's useful, but not enough. One from Ismail. Sorry, go on.
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay. From Ismail, and I'm sorry if I'm not pronouncing correctly the names. Gotasab. One of the factor of loss of productivity is QHSC requirement. If your client holds very strict such protocols, those are affecting the execution flow? Please comment. Yes, but then again, it comes back to, was it known at the time of the bid? Because if you have your own requirements, for one, you have to consider that, how it's going to impact your productivity in your bid, right, in your proposal, in your planning. And if it is a requirement from the owner, then if it's known beforehand as you're putting together a proposal and presenting your offer, then you also have to consider those into effect. If they're new, which also happens, right? So often those contracts are so long that they often, they're bid in a moment where the requirements are one, and then as you start doing the work, the requirements are another. Then more often than not, the owner will pay for whatever difference there is. But it comes back to the, how the contract was put together, which is also an important component of
I think
that.
we have last one question from Khalid.
Okay. So it says, I recall on one of the projects I worked on it before, we faced the difficulty of proofing of the disruption impact on the productivity resulted because of the COVID. We submitted to clients the previous trend of our productivity versus productivity in the months of COVID outbreak on sites. Then we used the comparison, right? The versus. Average actual productivity pre-COVID, it was 0.92. Post-COVID, the 3 months of COVID outbreak was 0.6. That's a 30% difference. The loss of productivity due to COVID was 0.32 times the planned workout to be earned times contractor labor rate hour. Yeah, so that's that's very current. That's the way to do it. You just want to make sure of all the discussion topics we were going through, right? So you want to make sure that COVID or COVID-related aspects were the only event taking place at that time impacting your labor productivity. You want to make sure there were no others. It comes back also to the contract. A lot of owners paid for that. A lot of other owners didn't. There's a legal discussion whether it was, force majeure or not. But the actual exercise here is exactly what we're talking about, right? So you compare one actual productivity rate against another actual productivity rate. You say it's a non-impacted period against an impacted period, and then you show the difference, right? And charge for the difference. That's exactly, the concept is there. I wouldn't know how to talk more about it without knowing more detail, but that's essentially what we want to do.
Okay, so thank you very much, Philip. I think if you wanted to answer one last, I think what is the main difference between the measure mile and the EBA method?
The earned value. Well, so the measure mile, as we're discussing, is pretty much their earned value has a component of planning as well, because you're comparing what you have earned as compared to a plan. The measure mile is what you have done against what you have done, right? So there's no planned component, so that's why it's better. But when it's not possible to do the measured mile, the earned value analysis will be very useful, because it goes into a level of detail that can show actual progress, right? So how you're earning your progress throughout time in the product. So that's on a very high level basis. That's a difference.
Okay, so thank you very much, Philip. So before we end, we would like, in behalf of AACE Arabian Gulf Section, present the certificate of appreciation for our technical webinar speaker for unforgivable mistake in quantification of loss of labor productivity, held March 23 via Zoom, signed by our president, Ghassan Hamad Al-Duzari. Thank you very much, Mr. Philip.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for the association, for the members, for your time and interest. It was an excellent experience. I hope next time it's in person. So let's work on that. I'm hoping to come and visit.
Thank you very much. I don't know if Susan is around. Okay. I think that's all. I think for the... May I call on Susan? Is around? No.
Larry, you can go for conclusion of vote of thanks.
Okay. So anyway, so thank you very much for all the attendees and for our technical webinar. So the presentation, so we will share to those who had filled up for your certificate of attendance. Don't forget to click the link to receive your certificate of attendance on this technical webinar. So good night and have a good day, everybody. Thank you, Philip.
Thank you. Have a good one. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you so much. Bye-bye.